The wind carried salt across the Pacific dawn. Engines murmured beneath hangars lined with frost-gray metal. On the deck of Yorktown, tarps rippled like tired flags. War had only begun, and already men spoke in whispers. The Devastator stood waiting, rivets dull, wings folded like broken arms. They called it the flying Coffin, slow, underarmed, outdated before it ever truly flew. Its pilots knew, and flew anyway. Records list its speed, barely 200 knots. Its torpedo, the Mark 13, prone to sink or spin off target, a weapon meant for another decade. In training reels, the brass still spoke of precision, but on the line, mechanics muttered prayers under oil-stained breath. One wrote on the fuselage, "If she brings me back, I'll believe again." December turned to February. The Pacific shimmered with wrecks. From Wake to Coral Sea, the Devastators bled the price of delay. At Midway's edge of dawn, 6 months later, their ghosts would return, but not yet. Now, the sound was only hammer and rivet, echoing through the naval yards of New Jersey. Inside Grumman's plant at Bethpage, Long Island, men worked without sunlight. Steel arcs threw sparks against half-painted hulls. The blueprint on the wall carried a new name: Torpedo Bomber, Experimental, Model F. A mechanic paused to watch a welder trace the first frame. He couldn't have known he was staring at an aircraft that would rewrite despair, but he felt it, the shift of air, the hum of a better idea. The engineers called it Avenger, smoother lines, stronger armor, a belly that could hold both torpedo and hope. Data came first. 100 horsepower, range doubled, armor plating around the pilot's seat, a defensive turret for the rear gunner, but it was more than numbers. It was the answer to every letter sent home by men who never returned. Outside, snow melted on the runway's edge. A test pilot climbed in. The cockpit still smelled of lacquer and sweat. He glanced once toward the hangar, where Devastators stood like aging brothers watching the new child take flight. Engines roared, deeper, surer. The nose lifted into pale winter light, and for the first time since Pearl Harbor, someone whispered, "Maybe this one can fight back." Smoke from the exhaust drifted east. It would find its way to Midway soon enough. The sea was flat that morning. Gray light spilled across the horizon, the kind that hides distance. Engines idled on Midway's coral runway, their sound small against the Pacific's breath. It was June 4th, 1942, barely 6 months after the smoke of Pearl Harbor. America was still learning how to fight back. The new aircraft stood waiting, 6 TBF Avengers. Fresh paint, factory scent still trapped beneath their wings. Each one carried a single Mark 13 torpedo, its casing glistening in the early haze. The men were volunteers from Torpedo Squadron 8, not from Yorktown or Hornet. Those squadrons had already sailed. These 6 came from training duty in Hawaii, summoned overnight. Their leader, Lieutenant Langdon K. Fieberling, young, calm, a man who had written to his wife that the sea feels quieter before something breaks. They launched at dawn, engines thundering against coral dust, the sound of 6 propellers fading eastward into the wind. Below, the island garrison watched until the dots vanished. One mechanic crossed himself. Another whispered, "Bring them home, God." The Avengers climbed to 6,000 feet, their course set toward the last radio fix on the approaching Japanese fleet. Beneath them, 2,000 miles of open water, no escort, no fighter cover, only the rising sun and a promise: find the enemy, strike first. Radar contact, 7:55 a.m. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, the core of the same task force that had burned Pearl Harbor. The Avengers descended through cloud. Wind buffeted their wings. Fieberling's voice came calm over radio. "Stand by for attack run." Then, black bursts ahead. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol was waiting. Zeros, fast, merciless, slicing through the formation. Tracer lines crossed the sky. The lead Avenger took a hit, smoke trailing from its engine. Gunner Manning fired back until his turret jammed. Within seconds, the formation broke apart. One plane spiraled into the sea. Another vanished into mist, leaving only floating debris and oil bloom. Still, the survivors pressed in. Fieberling held course, low and straight, toward the carrier Hiryu. Machine gun fire shattered his canopy, yet he stayed level, steady, until release. Mark 13 dropped. A white plume followed. The torpedo skipped once, then failed to detonate. His Avenger hit seconds later, bursting into flame on impact. The shock rolled across the water like a heartbeat. Only one aircraft made it back. Its fuselage riddled, one landing gear gone, crew bleeding. They dragged themselves out and saluted the flag still trembling in the wind. Of 6, 5 were lost, but their attack, unseen by them, would open the door for the dive bombers that followed. Historians would later write, "They found no glory, only direction." Because their sacrifice drew the Japanese fighters down, leaving the carriers unguarded, exposed for the next strike. That was the invisible hinge of Midway. Not in the sky's thunder, but in 6 aircraft that refused to turn away. The sea carried their silence long after. Oil slicks widened under the noon light. A gull circled once, then was gone. Back on Midway, the mechanic who'd crossed himself watched the horizon. Engines, faint, uneven, approached through the haze. The single Avenger touched down, bounced once, then skidded to rest. He walked toward it quietly. The pilot, George Gay, opened the hatch with shaking hands. No words, just a nod, grease mixed with tears. Somewhere over the Pacific, smoke rose where 4 Japanese carriers once sailed. The tide had turned, not through perfection, but through courage that refused logic. The wind that morning still smelled of fuel and salt, but beneath it, something new lingered, the first scent of hope. The ocean was quiet again, only the hiss of steam and the crack of burning oil. By dawn, the horizon was a line of smoke and drifting wreckage. Midway was over. 4 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, gone within hours. An empire's pride sinking beneath gray Pacific waves. Yet on the American side, silence weighed heavier than triumph. The decks of Yorktown were slick with fuel and prayer. She had taken 3 direct hits before her heart stopped beating. Sailors lined the rails, watching her list slowly starboard. Some whispered her name as if to hold her afloat. Others turned away, unable to bear the sound of steel surrendering to sea. Records show she sank on June 7, 1942, 07:01 a.m. Depth, 17,000 feet. Casualties, 141. But the number doesn't hold the breath of men who stayed behind to save her. In the wardroom, messages lay scattered. Telegrams drafted for families who would never see the ocean the same way again. One read simply, "Your son flew bravely, he did not suffer." No one ever knew who wrote it, but the pen marks wavered, like hands that couldn't quite stop shaking. At Pearl Harbor's hospital wing, the lone Avenger crew from Midway was being treated. Pilot George Gay sat upright, arm in sling, eyes bandaged from burns. A nurse later recalled he kept asking one question: did it work? When told that Japan's carriers were burning, he only nodded once. Then he turned his head to the window, where dawn light touched the sea like mercy. Across the ocean, Japanese survivors floated amid oil and silence. Some clung to planks, others to memory. Admiral Nagumo's staff radioed Tokyo, 4 carriers lost, air groups destroyed. There were no words for the sound of defeat over open water. The Avengers' debut had been written in sacrifice. Of 6 that flew, only 1 returned, but the pattern had shifted. Courage had bridged failure to victory. In the weeks that followed, the Navy gathered lessons from wreckage. Mark 13 torpedoes were redesigned. Avenger squadrons retrained for coordinated strikes. Mechanics learned to trust what courage had already proven possible. A memo from Naval Air Command read, "The TBF performed as designed. The men, better still." At Bethpage, Long Island, the assembly line never slept. Women in bandanas riveted new fuselages. The air smelled of oil, paint, and rationed coffee. A supervisor pinned a note above the production chart. Midway was only the beginning. Build for the men who didn't come home. Through the summer of 1942, more than 400 Avengers rolled off the line. Their engines carried the hum of promise. Their wings bore the fingerprints of every worker who'd lost someone at sea. Strategically, the balance had turned. Japan would never again strike freely across the Pacific. But for the men who had flown into that storm, victory had no sound, only absence. At Arlington, rows of new markers appeared, names carved shallow, some without remains beneath. A chaplain stood under the June sun, reading from a small Bible damp with sweat. His voice trembled only once. They fought not for glory, but to keep the light from going out. That evening, the Pacific went still. Ash from the fires drifted across miles of open water. And on the wind, faint but real, came the echo of engines, somewhere between memory and sky. Engines roared again across the eastern seaboard. Winter fog rolled over the Grumman plant at Bethpage, and from its open doors came a new sound, deeper, steadier, unafraid. The Avenger had returned, no longer a prototype. Now, a weapon reborn in steel and resolve. By spring 1943, production outpaced imagination. 3,000 airframes in motion, factories humming 20 hours a day. Women worked the lines, hair tied back, rivet guns trembling against aluminum ribs. Each strike echoed like a heartbeat for someone they had lost. A small photo pinned above one workstation read, TS-8, Midway. They built them heavier, stronger, with folding wings to fit carrier decks and new armor around the belly. Its turret, powered by hydraulic gears, turned with the calm precision of revenge. Data spoke first. 100 horsepower Wright Cyclone engine, range over 1,000 miles. Payload, 2,000 pounds of ordnance or one torpedo, but the numbers were only surface. Beneath them lived the ghosts of 6 men who proved it could fly through hell. At Norfolk, training squadrons filled the dawn sky. Young pilots, some barely 20, learned to wrestle the Avenger's weight off the deck. Its frame demanded patience, strength, humility. Instructors warned, "She forgives nothing, but she'll protect you if you respect her." They called her Grumman Iron Works, a name said with pride and superstition. By mid-year, Avengers flew from every major carrier, Essex, Bunker Hill, Enterprise. The Navy had its answer to Japan's zero, not through speed or grace, but through endurance, the kind that outlasted storms. Across the Pacific, the Japanese fleet felt the shift. Their pilots had once mocked the Devastator's sluggish crawl, calling it the Coffin with wings. Now, the Avenger's silhouette meant only one thing: death coming low and sure. June 1943. The Solomon Islands Campaign. Torpedo Squadron 11 launched from USS Hornet before dawn. Their target, a Japanese convoy near Bougainville. Rain fell in sheets. Engines screamed against crosswind. Below, tracer fire wove a red net across the sea. The first wave went in, low, deliberate, every man trusting the armor beneath him. When the torpedoes hit, the sea erupted in columns of fire and spray. Observers reported 2 destroyers and 1 cruiser crippled within minutes. For the first time, the Avengers came home intact. On deck, sailors cheered, not loudly, but with the relief of men who'd waited too long. One gunner leaned against his turret, whispering, "They laughed once, not anymore." That night, the carrier decks glowed under battle lanterns. Crews rearmed in silence, salt drying on their uniforms. Somewhere below deck, a radio played faint jazz from San Diego. In the logbook, a single line was written, "The Avenger has come into her own." Strategically, she had become more than a bomber. She was a bridge between eras, old courage meeting new engineering. Each mission refined tactics, timing, precision, and each return flight felt like defiance turned into method. On the mainland, newspapers caught up to the story. "The flying coffin redeemed," one headline read. But for the crews, redemption was never the goal. Survival was. By the year's end, Avengers hunted submarines in the Atlantic, patrolled convoy routes through fog and lightning. Their sonar buoys marked unseen wars beneath the waves. From Tarawa to the Gilberts, their shadows crossed every mile where the Pacific still remembered Midway. At night, flight decks cooled under the stars. Mechanics sat smoking in silence, listening to the ticking of cooling engines, the sound of victory breathing slow. And somewhere between those breaths, you could almost hear it, the faint laughter of men once mocked for flying coffins, now echoing through the roar of machines that outlived them. The Avenger had found its purpose, and the war was far from over. The Pacific was no longer blue. It had turned the color of smoke and iron. By 1904, the Avenger flew across every horizon where the Empire still stood, from the Marshalls to the Marianas, from Truk Lagoon to the Philippine Sea. Its shadow fell before every carrier strike. Engines roared in threes, their sound steady and practiced. Each squadron moved like a single organism, pilots, radio men, gunners breathing to the same rhythm of flight. On USS Enterprise, dawn briefings filled the ready rooms. Maps pinned with red string marked targets across the Pacific Arc. Commanders spoke in clipped duns, their words simple now: find, strike, survive. The Avenger was the workhorse, the Navy's most dependable beast. It carried torpedoes, bombs, depth charges, and faith. Data etched its legend. By 1904, over 7,500 built. Combat radius expanded to 100 miles. Crews trained for synchronized torpedo runs, a ballet of precision and nerve. But under the steel and oil, the human cost deepened. Each pilot carried not only orders, but ghosts. The war had become a rhythm too, one of absence, of names crossed from rosters before nightfall. June 19th, 1904. The Battle of the Philippine Sea. Morning broke under pale sun, and the sky filled with the largest carrier armada in history. Admiral Raymond Spruance called it a decisive day. The crews simply called it the turkey shoot. Avengers rolled from the decks of 15 carriers. Below them, radar picked up wave after wave of incoming Japanese aircraft, hundreds of Zeros and dive bombers closing in. The first clashes came fast. Tracer lines stitched the sky from horizon to horizon. Fighters tangled above, while Avengers dove through smoke to strike the carriers below. Lieutenant Harold Buell remembered seeing the sun flicker behind black columns of rising fuel. He said later, "It felt like flying through the end of the world." Below, the Japanese fleet burned, 3 carriers lost, 400 aircraft destroyed, and the sea littered with flame and silence. The Avenger's role had changed. It was no longer merely a torpedo plane. It was a hunter, a guardian, a witness. Its radar pods searched for submarines through night fog. Its depth charges echoed across unseen depths. In the Atlantic, they tracked and sank U-boats stalking Allied convoys. Technology had caught up with courage, but courage remained the price of flight. By autumn, Avengers flew over Leyte Gulf, their wings heavy with fuel and rain. Below, the largest naval battle in history unfolded. Japanese super battleships Yamato and Musashi fired into the horizon, each broadside shaking the ocean itself. Avengers came in low, through smoke and chaos, their torpedoes threading paths between fountains of steel. Musashi took 19 hits before she stopped moving, each strike marked by a bloom of fire, a column of black water. A single squadron commander later wrote, "We didn't cheer, we just watched her die, knowing what it meant." As dusk fell, the Pacific sky glowed with the last light of burning ships. Pilots guided crippled Avengers home by the flash of explosions behind them. Carrier decks waited, long, narrow, and slick with rain. Every landing felt like balancing life between sky and sea. Some made it, some didn't. That night, the mess halls were silent, plates half-eaten, hands still shaking from adrenaline and memory. A mechanic placed a new decal on the fuselage of a returning Avenger, a small, painted angel with folded wings. He said softly, "For the ones who never made it back." The Avenger had become the voice of persistence, the sound of engines refusing to quit, even when the world around them burned. And somewhere in the darkness, as waves slapped gently against the hull, a lone pilot wrote in his logbook, "The flying Coffin laughs last, and she laughs quietly, like the sea after battle." Night over the Pacific was never truly dark. Engines glowed faintly against low clouds. The sea caught their light, silver trails in an endless black mirror. By late 1904, the Avenger had become familiar, its frame, its scent, its voice in the wind. Every crewman knew its rattle, its rhythm, its quiet hum before takeoff. Yet behind every mission report was a life, a photograph taped to the dashboard, a letter folded inside a flight jacket, a prayer whispered before the canopy closed. In Torpedo Squadron 84, one mechanic marked each safe return with a white chalk line along the hangar wall. By Christmas, there were 32 lines. He said he had stopped counting when the war stopped asking. At Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii, new crews trained for Iwo Jima and Okinawa. You could hear them at dawn, engines coughing to life, waves breaking against the reef, gulls startled into flight. Salt, oil, and morning heat mixed into one breath of war. The Avenger was heavy to lift, but forgiving once airborne. Its wings held steady even in crosswind, as if it understood the weight it carried. Pilots often spoke to it, not out loud, but in thought, in habit. Before a dive, "Hold with me." Before landing, "Just one more time." Records show over 7,800 built by 1945. More than any other torpedo bomber in the war, each one assembled by thousands of hands who'd never see the front. In Detroit, a woman named Eleanor Madsen wrote her son every Sunday. He flew an Avenger from USS Bunker Hill. She worked in the factory that made his landing gear. Neither knew they'd both touched the same machine. February 1945. The sky above Iwo Jima burned white with tracers. Avengers orbited above Mount Suribachi, dropping bombs through volcanic haze, guiding Marines by radio through smoke and confusion. A gunner named Price recalled later, "The island looked like it was breathing fire. I could smell earth burning through my mask." When the flag rose on the mountain, Avengers circled low, not celebrating, but marking the end of another 1,000 names on a list. The war was reaching its final circle. Each mission felt longer, heavier, more personal. Pilots no longer flew for medals, but for the faces in their wallets. One evening aboard USS Essex, as Okinawa burned beyond the horizon, a chaplain stood near the flight deck rail. He watched the sun dip behind smoke and whispered a line he'd used too often. "Lord, let them land before the light dies." Below deck, a young radio man fixed his transmitter with trembling hands. He'd been on 16 sorties, 17 after tomorrow. He kept a scrap of paper tucked inside his uniform, a verse copied from his father's Bible. "He maketh the clouds his chariot." That night, the ship's intercom crackled once, then fell silent but for the ocean's steady breath. Men slept in narrow bunks, the sound of engines pulsing through the steel. And in that rhythm, the thrum of propellers and heartbeat, the human and the machine had become one. Each trusted the other completely. Each bore the memory of the other's courage. When dawn came, the Avenger rose again, through mist, through exhaustion, through the long gray light of duty. The war had not yet ended. But something deeper had begun, a quiet understanding between man, machine, and the price of survival. The Pacific wind carried it forward, toward the final storms of 1945. The sea turned gray again in the spring of 1945. Rain swept across the decks like ash from a dying world. The men called it the long season, when every dawn looked the same, and each mission might be the last. Okinawa lay ahead, the final gate before Japan itself. Over 500,000 men, 7,000 aircraft, and the full weight of the Pacific Fleet converged on one volcanic island. From the decks of Essex, Bunker Hill, and Intrepid, Avengers stood lined in rows, dark, heavy, unshaken. Their metal skin bore scars from earlier wars, each dent a memory, each patch a story. April 1st, 1945, Easter Sunday. Engines thundered before dawn. The ocean seemed to hold its breath. And then wave after wave of Avengers lifted into the mist. Their targets were not ships this time, but caves, tunnels, and ridgelines where resistance refused to die. The Avenger had become a precision instrument of endurance, its radar and ordnance guiding Marines inch by inch across the island's edge. But above them, something new appeared, planes diving with no intention to return. The kamikaze. Reports list more than 100 suicide attacks during the Okinawa campaign. They came in pairs, in swarms, sometimes from clouds so bright a man could mistake them for sunlight. April 11th, USS Bunker Hill struck twice within seconds. 2 kamikaze tore through her decks, fuel igniting into walls of flame. Avenger crews waiting to launch never stood a chance. The blast hurled aircraft like toys into the sea. Photographs show fire rolling across the flight deck, men running silhouettes against an orange sky. Pilot George Brown later wrote, "We trained to die fighting. We never trained to burn waiting." Smoke curled for hours. 17 Avengers destroyed. Almost 400 men lost. Yet by nightfall, repair crews worked under the same ruin they survived. One mechanic used a flashlight gripped between his teeth, replacing rivets beside a still-burning wreck. When asked why, he said, "She'll fly again tomorrow." And she did. Within 48 hours, Avengers were back in the air, hunting Japanese submarines and spotting artillery from Marines ashore. Their persistence became a message, not just of strength, but of refusal. A belief that duty could outlast even despair. Each mission blurred into the next. Rain, smoke, salt, sweat, a rhythm without end. Crews landed and launched again, faces blackened, eyes rimmed with sleepless light. Inside the cockpit, everything narrowed to sound. Engine pitch, radio hum, heartbeat. The line between courage and exhaustion grew thin as vapor. One pilot described flying through a storm at dusk, rain so thick it felt like flying through time itself. He said, "When the lightning flashed, I saw every man I'd ever lost." By June, Okinawa was nearly over, but victory looked nothing like triumph. It looked like smoke still rising, and aircraft returning one engine short. Strategically, the campaign broke Japan's naval spine, but humanly, it hollowed those who survived. The Avengers had endured what flesh barely could. On the final night before withdrawal, squadrons gathered on deck for roll call. Names were read into wind and silence. Each pause meant a voice that would not answer. The chaplain's Bible pages fluttered under floodlights. His prayer was simple: "May the sea be kind to them, and may we never forget their sky." Engines cooled one last time that evening. Metal ticked softly in the dark. And above the black horizon, a faint dawn began to rise, thin, pale, and merciful. August came heavy with heat and rumor. The sea lay calm, but the air carried a strange stillness, a sense that the world itself was holding its breath. The Avengers still flew their patrols. Across Okinawa's fading smoke and the waters east of Formosa, they searched for submarines that no longer dared surface. The engines hummed through clouds as though unwilling to believe peace could exist. Then came the message, short, coded, final. Special weapon deployed, results conclusive. No one on the carrier decks knew what it meant, only that the war was changing shape faster than sound could carry. Days later, photographs arrived. Hiroshima in ruin, Nagasaki burning. Pilots gathered around a single sheet of newsprint. No one spoke. One man folded the page carefully and said, "So this is how it ends." The thunder that silenced the Pacific was unlike any before. No explosion, no fight, no heroism, only light too bright for memory. And after that, an endless quiet. On August 15th, Emperor Hirohito's voice reached across radio static. Unconditional surrender. For a moment, even the waves seemed to stop. On USS Enterprise, a whistle sounded once. Not sharp, not triumphant, just a long exhale of years of exhaustion. Crewmen gathered on deck. Some cheered, others stared at the horizon as if expecting another attack. One gunner from Torpedo Squadron 84 simply sat beside his Avenger, hand resting on the fuselage, whispering, "We made it." The final mission logs of the Pacific War were written in pencil. Aircraft returned to base. Engines shut down. The silence that followed felt heavier than any battle. In hangars, tools lay still for the first time. Mechanics unpinned the photos from their workbenches. Letters were mailed without censor stamps. The air smelled of oil, dust, and disbelief. In the months that followed, the Avengers were decommissioned, flown home across the same seas they had once darkened with smoke. Some were scrapped, others sent to training schools or museums. But a few, the lucky ones, found quiet airfields under American sun. At one such field in California, a pilot named Robert Taylor walked the length of his old aircraft. The paint had faded. The propellers were locked with rust. He ran his hand along the wing and said softly, "You never failed me." In Washington, officials drafted statistics. More than 7,800 Avengers built, over 135,000 sorties flown, thousands of enemy ships sunk or crippled, yet numbers couldn't measure the thing they carried, the will to keep returning when logic said not to. Across the nation, bells rang for victory, but inside many homes, the sound was answered by quiet, photographs on mantels, empty chairs, flax folded into perfect triangles. In Long Island, the Grumman plant stood silent under morning haze. The same hangar that had once echoed with rivet hammers now held only dust motes and faint ghosts of laughter. A single worker, one of the last, swept the floor and paused, listening as if expecting engines to start again. Outside, cicadas sang in summer heat. He looked toward the empty runway and said to no one, "It's over now. They can rest." And somewhere far out over the Pacific, where waves still move above the bones of carriers and planes, the light falls gently through clear water. You can almost hear the echo of propellers turning slow, as if time itself remembers the sound of courage. The Avenger had outlived the war it was built for, but its meaning endured, not in metal, but in memory, not in victory, but in the quiet that followed it. For those who came home, freedom was not a word. It was a promise paid in silence.